One of my favorite things about doing this channel is getting to play games that not only did I not get a chance to play back in the day, but that also I had never heard of until I started this little collection of games behind me, which, believe it or not, is actually more games than I realized, even though I felt like that I did a decent job of reading magazines and browsing Electronics Boutique and Babbage's back in the day. Now, sometimes going into review completely blind like that has worked out extremely well, like say in the case of Asterix for the Master System. And then other titles, well, not so well. For instance, Tom and Jerry, also on the Master System. Games that I had never even heard of from this era usually fall into two categories. Either they were international releases that did not come from Japan, because usually the game magazines and import companies at the time usually had Japan covered while ignoring Europe. Or they were games that came out later in the 16-bit era. Without getting into the whole generational console debate, I didn't own a Sega CD or a 32X when they were originally released, and by the time that they were affordable, I was already on to other things. What that means, though, is that there's a good portion of at least the Sega CD library, maybe not so much the 32X library due to its smaller size, that totally missed me upon release. And today's review is one of those titles, which is Battlecorps, published and developed by Core Design and released in the Sega CD in the United States in August of 1994. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are thoroughly confused as to why I'm talking about a game from Core Design from the mid-90s that doesn't involve pyramid-shaped boobs. Yes, they're real, and in 1996, they were spectacular. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, rather than try to lock my butler in the freezer, I'm instead out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Now, where were we before I started talking about a game that I'm not going to review for the channel? Oh yeah, Core Design. While I was joking about Tomb Raider, that game is where I first came to know Core Design as a household name, due to their logo being presented right on the cover of the game. Now, of course, they had been around since long before that, but at least in the United States, you wouldn't really know it because their name wasn't on the cover of the titles that they worked on, like, say, Chuck Rock and Jaguar XJ220. Or on the front cover, anyway. So, what kind of game is Battlecorps? Is it some sort of FMV title like the console was known for? Is it a shooter, strategy, puzzle? Yeah, okay, probably not a puzzle game. That would be just silly. Although if someone was to come out with a sci-fi puzzle game that also had some action and violence, I'd probably be into it. Anyway, I'll figure all that out and hopefully have some fun in doing so, but first, a look at the thankfully not broken package. And here's my copy of Battlecorps for the Sega CD. First thing to look at on the Sega CD titles, at least on the ones in the oversized jewel cases, is the condition of the hinges on the cover, and thankfully they're fully intact, so no flopping around or falling apart when you open this one up. It's not meant to be sure, as there is plenty of surface scratching, but thankfully the only real damage is a small stress fracture on the rear of the case. I don't remember where or when I picked this one up, but I think it was relatively recently, maybe within the last 2 years or so. If you decide you want one for yourself, copies are currently averaging around $40 on price charting, and I think that's probably pretty close to what I paid for it, so pretty reasonable for less common Sega CD titles. As far as the front cover goes, it's not bad. Not sure I'd say it's awesome, but it at least uses the space well, and I could see being somewhat eye-catching on the shelf. I will say, and this is something that probably might not make sense because it's not something that I can really explain, just feel, but the art seems British to me, which makes sense with it being from Core. Now, I looked into it a bit, and the artist is actually a guy named James Ryman, who actually is British,
and is a pretty good artist in his own right. I'll link his website down below if you want to check out some of his other work, and for our purposes also includes cover art on Soulstar and Skeleton Crew, titles that I'm definitely interested in reviewing eventually. There is one catch with the cover art, and since this is one of the Sega CD titles that actually saw releases in all 3 major regions, there is a Japanese release to look at, and you'd probably be not surprised to know that it has a wildly different cover. This is a tough one to me, as I think they're both great covers, but clearly also very different styles at play, with the Japanese cover going for more of a hard sci-fi look, probably thinking that that would appeal more to the Japanese fanbase. Ultimately, I think the non-Japanese cover better reflects the game, but I don't think that you can go wrong with either of these. Flipping over the back, and there's actually not a ton going on back here, with Core seemingly content to let screenshots from the game and quotes from game magazines speak for themselves. This is pretty unusual, and I've got to say, in almost 250 episodes of doing Zilog and Moto, I don't think I recall having a rear cover in a North American release that says this little about the game, except for maybe something like DJ Boy, and, well, probably the less said about that, the better. The screenshots are excellent though, and really do their job of making the game look next-gen, which is of course important, seeing as how the Saturn was just a few months away from being released in Japan. Unfortunately, the text that's included definitely could have used a copy editor. That's a hell of a run-on sentence there. And that quote from EGM that states that the game is an incredible mech simulation and that it's called Battlecorps. And really not much else. Now, granted, EGM and all their related magazines were basically fit to line bird cages, but really, you couldn't find a quote that said anything more than just, "It's incredible"? Moving on, opening up the case, the manual is in nice condition other than a minor crease. For a supposed mech sim, the game is actually relatively simple, so the manual isn't that necessary to the gameplay, but I do like the effort that went into spelling out the controls, and then later on where each level is broken down as to what you're doing and what type of level it is. Similar instructions are presented in-game when you get to a mission briefing, but for whatever reason, they made Lieutenant Calgary, the bearded cigar-chomping officer from the cover, have an effect on his voice, I guess to make him sound virtual, but all it really does is make him hard to understand, so it's nice to have all of that written down instead. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into the game and blow some crap up. Hopefully, besides ourselves. To clarify my question from earlier about the game's genre, Battlecorps is a game where you control a large mech, and have to make your way through 12 levels before a showdown with a final boss. I just mentioned that EGM was quoted on the back of the box as calling the game a mech simulation, and I've got to be honest, not only did I not know that that was a genre, I've got to say I also think it's a somewhat of a contradiction in terms. I mean, simulation implies that you're simulating something from real life, and last I checked, the US Army doesn't have a bunch of Metal Gears running around and keeping the peace around the world. Or, I mean, maybe they do when it's classified, and they're using the Space Force budget to pay for it, since they're not doing anything anyway. I mean, who can say for sure? I guess I never really thought about it before, but a mech game, simulation or otherwise, is a type of genre, although in the case of Battlecorps, it's probably more accurate to call it a first-person shooter that just happens to have a very specific control scheme, centered around the speed that you move forwards and backwards. The game has an interesting backstory that you can either read in the introduction in the manual or listen as Lieutenant Calgary's disembodied robotic floating head goes over the details as the beginning cutscene plays. But I'm going to save you some time and just say that the AI that controls your company's mining equipment is having a bad day, and it's up to the Battlecorps' 3 mech pilots to march in and stop the madness by blowing everything up, allowing your company to retake the mining planet and get those sweet profits rolling in again. And while yes, I'm being a bit flippant here, in all seriousness, the plot is just simply not that deep, and certainly isn't anything that you probably haven't seen before. To be fair to Core, I don't think they were really taking things that seriously either, and are leaning into some of that cheesiness. Case in point, let's discuss the names of the 3 mech pilots that the Battlecorps is sending in to take care of Moses, that previously mentioned rogue virus-infested AI. First, there's the all-around average pilot Jack Cutter, the fast but less powerful Becky Ojo, and the slow but strong Dika A. Jang, with the A in quotes. Why is the A in quotes? No one knows! Okay, so maybe the names themselves are somewhat benign, but then there's the character descriptions. For instance, Becky Ojo is apparently a pumped-up kickboxer from the corporate barrio. She's faster than a speed and plasma pulse and badder than a Yakuza hitter. I mean, okay, that's cool and all, although I definitely have questions about what the hell a corporate barrio is, but I'm not super clear on what Becky being a kickboxer has to do with her ability to pilot a mech. Also, why is Becky's mech faster and weaker than the 2 other mechs? Aren't they all the same, according to the manual? An Armordillo model, and yes, you heard me correctly, these are Armordillos, separate from the animal armadillo. We probably should just ignore Dika A. Jang's bio of being a gene-spliced polymorph with a downloaded cyberpsychosis and just move on, because I'm not sure that I've got enough time left in this video to unpack that one. Anyway, regardless of any of the story or background, the whole point is that having 3 different characters to choose from gives Battlecorps some strategy as to how you want to play the game, and adds an interesting life mechanic that I only recall being seen used in a few games, like say the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Double Dragon 3, where rather than the characters themselves having multiple lives, you just have this specific roster of players, and once they all go down, it's game over. This has the potential to leave you in a situation where perhaps you like playing as a faster character or a stronger character, but if you happen to make a mistake and die on a level, you have to try to make do with who you have left. Also, the game will recommend using a specific character on a level, so even the game somewhat acknowledges that the characteristics are better suited for being used in certain scenarios, but if you don't have that character, it's definitely not the end of the world, and you are free to choose whoever you want that's available before you start a level. One thing that I thought was a nice touch is that the game includes a practice level, so you can get a feel for how the game plays and the various weapons that you have at your disposal. I haven't mentioned this thus far, but for full disclosure, much like puzzle games, mech games tend to leave me somewhat A lot of that is simply due to the fact that I'm not a hard sci-fi guy, and a lot of mech stuff seems to be based around those sorts of ideas. But along with that, the gameplay involved in mech titles can be somewhat complex, and maybe perhaps that's why EGM referred to the genre as a mech simulation. Anyone that's seen Steel Battalion up and running in all its glory at a gaming convention knows exactly what I'm talking about. To Core's credit, they managed to distill the gameplay down to make it work on a 3 or 6 button controller, so it's not overly complex, but it's still nice to have that practice level so that you can wander around for a bit and blow things up without consequence, and then decide which of the game's 2 control mechanisms that you prefer. Now, I don't want to get too into the weeds on the game's control, but I will say that for a console that predates controllers having multiple types of thumbsticks at the developer's disposal, Core did probably as good a job as you can expect with making the game work while having all of the directional responsibilities mapped to one lone D-pad. I do have one beef, however, and that is that regardless of which of the 2 control schemes that you select, targeting in your mech uses aviation controls, and there's no way to change that. I understand what they were going for, but for a game where time can be of the essence when trying to adjust aiming up or down, having the controls be inverted in what's essentially a first-person shooter ends up going against 25 years of muscle memory from me, and it just feels wrong. You'll end up adjusting after a while, but it still never felt natural, and I just can't fathom how they didn't think to make this an option for players, rather than forcing everyone to just use the default scheme. Like any good first-person shooter from the era, your mechs are loaded down with several different types of armaments for taking out any defense that might be in your way, or just even random things around the level that you don't like the looks of. By default, you have a standard chain gun with unlimited ammo, but that can overheat with too much use. Along with that, you also have auto-targeting rockets, mortars that can either be fired solo or 3 at a time, a plasma gun with limited ammo, and even a flamethrower. All great in theory, and if I can call it the manual for a minute, apparently one other difference between your mech pilots was originally supposed to be how much of each of the ordnance that your pilot started out with. But apparently that was scrapped at some point, and everyone ends up with the same loadouts. Unfortunately, targeting can be a bit rough depending on which weapon you're using, and it really would have been nice to have some auto-targeting up and down, a la Doom, rather than have you fumble around with manually aiming. Also, the rockets, while they're cool and all, they end up just targeting what's the closest thing to you, even if that's not what you're actually aiming at, and that is not what you want, especially when you're being fired at. From a graphics perspective, I was very impressed with Battlecorps. Yes, technically the game utilizes the age-old trick of having the actual view area only be a small section of the on-screen display, making it easier on the Sega CD to process things. But there's still plenty of viewable space left over to be able to see what you're doing. And the game is animated well, with the scaling and rotation powers of the Sega CD being put on full display. Along with those technical niceties, the designers did a good job of using color and got the most out of the Sega CD's limited color palette, with different levels having very different color schemes depending on the type of level. I was honestly shocked that the game ran as well as it did, because while I know that scaling and rotation was one of the hallmarks of the Sega CD's design, I don't think I've seen it implemented as well as it is here so far on the channel. For a console-based first-person shooter from the 16-bit era, the graphics in Battlecorps are about as good as it gets. I think perhaps the only issue I ran into is only partially a graphical problem, with enemies specifically only appearing when you get a specific distance away, which ends up being a double-edged sword, with you essentially being able to hide by backing away, but at the same time the enemies can often see you before you see them, right as they come into view. It's nitpicking to be sure, as the graphics are still impressive for the era nonetheless. Sound-wise, with it being a Sega CD title, you'd expect it to have excellent sound, and it does, for the most part anyway. I did have a few issues with it, however. One was the aforementioned voice of Lieutenant Calgary. It just really didn't need that extra distortion. Then it also sounds like that in some of the background music there's also some speech buried, where it sounds like it's radio instructions about what's currently going on in the level, but they're recorded at such a low level as compared to the music that they're almost impossible to make out. Now, if they're just a sample to enhance the music, then I guess I kind of understand it, but it's definitely a choice in the audio department. There is one thing I've got to mention though, and it's something that was driving me crazy for a bit while playing it. Apparently the background music that's used in level 2 completely rips off the main riff from the X-Men cartoon from the 90s. Now, I hadn't watched that in, well, probably 30 years, so I was racking my brain trying to figure out where I'd heard that riff before, and then finally it popped into my head. I'm just curious if Anthony Wheeldon, who is credited as playing the guitar in the soundtrack, did it on purpose, or if it's just a total random thing. But it's nearly impossible to hear the two back to back and not make that connection. From a technical perspective, it's definitely hard to knock Battlecorps, especially considering the fact that the game was released in the summer of 1994. And I've played first-person shooters on 32-bit systems that didn't move as well, and anyone that's played Doom on the 3DO knows exactly what I'm talking about. My main issues with the game are purely from a structural and difficulty perspective. To be perfectly honest, while I had no issues with the game's first two levels, and actually found them to be well balanced from a difficulty perspective, the third level changed that, and even after multiple attempts and dropping the difficulty down to easy, I still couldn't get more than about halfway through. And maybe I just need more experience with the game, or maybe it's just not the type of game that I'm good at, but only being able to get a quarter of the way through the game in easy definitely strikes me as a bit of a red flag. On the structural side, as mentioned, each of the three mech pilots essentially serves as a life, and there's no extra lives, so once a mech goes down, that is it. The game does provide one continue, and while that's nice, regardless of the game's difficulty, not having any kind of password or save system is cumbersome to say the least. With each level averaging about 15 minutes, that means that even if you're good at the game, to beat it is going to require about 3.5 hours uninterrupted. And that's a bit of a commitment for most people. The game does feature a level select code if you want to cheat, but there should have been a built-in better way to handle this, especially for when the game was released. Battlecorps is a game that I struggle to rate, and even after I thought I was done playing the game for the review, I still had doubts about my thoughts, and had to give it one last play to make sure that I knew what I wanted to do. Originally, due to those difficulty and structural concerns, I was only going to give the game 2 stars officially, because it's hard for me to give more than that to a game that I can honestly only make it a quarter of the way through. But ultimately, I think the difficulty issue is probably more of a me problem than a game problem, and I didn't think it was fair to penalize the rest of the game, which is a technical marvel. As a result, I'm giving Battlecorps 3 stars, but be warned, it is definitely not for everyone, especially those that don't have a lot of free time on their hands.
Okay, and that's it for Battlecorps on the Sega CD. While I wish the game was a bit more forgiving, like say for instance, one of the mechanics is having energy lines that can get you health back. Why is that not on every level? I can't deny that the game did its best to help the Sega CD really reach its full potential. And I did legitimately have fun on those first 2 levels, something that I don't think that I've ever really said about a mech game, except for the somewhat forgotten Shogo Mobile Armor Division. And if you haven't played that, I definitely recommend it, and it's on both GOG and Steam right now for $10, if you want to take a look. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's a game that I've been looking forward to reviewing for a very long time. And in fact, if I followed my normal schedule, I would have reviewed it, 130 episodes ago, give or take a few. Unfortunately, I just never got around to picking up a copy of it until recently, but I've finally got my hands on it, so I'm very interested to see how yet another Master System title that we didn't get in the United States turned out. And I'm not going to drop any silly puns or clues here. I've mentioned this one a few times now. I think you can probably figure it out. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 243. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.